Good morning. It is a lovely Tuesday morning, and this morning we're looking for a blessing from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 6, the Sermon on the Mount, and especially the Lord's Prayer, or sometimes called the Disciples' Prayer, that prayer that Jesus taught us to pray. We've been going through it, started it a couple of weeks ago, and today we come to verse 11 of chapter 6, and to a simple request that reads like this: give us this day our daily bread. Now, over the years, I prayed this prayer both alone and with church families and before, probably hundreds of times. And I have to confess that every time I come to this phrase, this sentence, I ask myself, is this really what Jesus wanted us to pray for? Out of all of the things we could ask for, does he really want us to ask for a day's bread for a day? You know, I'm willing to bet that everyone who is listening to or watching this video doesn't have a need for daily bread. We've got bread in the cupboard for a day, for probably a week or a month in the freezer, and if we run out, we can go to the market and get some more. So I'm not sure that that's what Jesus was getting at. Well, maybe he was suggesting that we pray for bread for a lifetime, so that we have bread every single day of our lives. But that doesn't feel right either. You remember when Jesus was led into the wilderness to be tempted? He fasted for 40 days. He was very, very hungry, and the devil came and tempted him. One of the temptations out of the three was, I know you're hungry. See these stones? Why don't you turn them into bread if you were the Son of God? Freshly baked bread when you've been fasting for 40 days. That's a temptation. And yet Jesus replied with words from the book of Deuteronomy, saying, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. See, Jesus knew that he needed more than bread, even when he was very, very hungry. And he knows that we need more than bread. So why the request, give us this day our daily bread? Elsewhere in the gospel, he referred to himself as the bread of life, the bread from heaven, more than just bread for a day. The woman at the well, remember her? She came for water, and Jesus said, I will give you living water, and you'll never thirst again. So Jesus understood in the wilderness. He understands for us that we need more than just daily bread. So what was he getting at? I think he was reminding us with this little request in the prayer that we need to look to God as the primary source for the deepest needs in our life. For bread and food, yes, but for much more than that, for every word that proceeds from his mouth, for our spiritual needs, to look to God as our provider. One of the names given to God in the Old Testament was Jehovah Jireh, which means God our provider. It's used many times in the Old Testament. We saw how the Jews would not even use the name Yahweh, which was the tetragrammaton, the four letters, YHWH, Yahweh. They wouldn't use that because of their respect for the name of God, and so they would substitute other names. One of those was Jehovah Jireh. The very first time it was used was in the book of Genesis and the story of Abraham and Isaac. You remember that Abraham was promised by God a son. God promised Abraham that he would have a son, and from him would grow a whole nation. And Abraham believed God, even when God instructed him to take his only son Isaac to Mount Moriah to sacrifice him. Now, how does that work? How does God promise Abram a son and then take him away from Abram? Well, we learn that Abraham believed God. He had such faith that he knew that if he followed through with what God instructed him to do and to take his son's life, that God would raise him from the dead. That's amazing faith. And if you remember the story, you remember that Abraham was ready to do it. He raised the knife over his son's neck, and God stopped him and said, "Do not harm the boy." And God provided a ram in place. A beautiful story that tells us of the substitute work of Jesus. And so Abram named that place where that happened, he named it Jehovah Jireh, God provides. And so it's a beautiful story of God's provision for us. And when we pray that prayer, when you pray that prayer today, and you come to the words, "Give us this day our daily bread," remember that God is the provider of so much more than daily bread. He is the source for the deepest needs in your life. Jehovah Jireh, our provider. Have a wonderful Tuesday.